Los Angeles, in the late 1960s, was a city that never truly slept. But after midnight, Chinatown grew quiet in a way that felt heavy and watchful. On one such night, Bruce Lee was alone inside a small gym hidden behind a closed storefront, training without mirrors, without students, and without an audience. He preferred these hours because there was no pressure to impress and no reason to perform. Every movement he practiced was stripped down to purpose, repetition, and refinement. This was not about looking powerful, it was about becoming efficient. Bruce was already questioning tradition, already pushing past what most martial artists were willing to accept, and those late nights were where his real evolution happened. The quiet rhythm of Bruce Lee's training was shattered when the door of the gym opened suddenly and forcefully, the sound echoing through the small space and instantly pulling Bruce out of his movement. He stopped, not out of surprise, but out of instinct, because he could feel that whoever had entered was not there by accident. A massive figure stepped inside, blocking much of the doorway with his sheer size. He was close to 7 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, thick through the chest, and carried the kind of weight that did not come from gym machines or mirror training, but from real physical confrontation. This was a man whose body had been shaped by impact, by resistance, and by nights spent fighting rather than posing. As he moved deeper into the room, the atmosphere changed completely. The air felt heavier, tighter, as if the space itself had been compressed by his presence. He did not look around with curiosity or admiration. He scanned the gym slowly, almost dismissively, as if judging it unworthy of his attention. His eyes then settled on Bruce Lee, and there was no hesitation in his expression, only doubt and quiet contempt. This was not a man seeking knowledge or respect. This was a man who was accustomed to being feared and obeyed, someone who measured others by how easily they could be broken. He did not bow, introduce himself, or acknowledge Bruce as a teacher or master. Instead, he spoke with the confidence of someone who believed size and strength were the ultimate authority. He said he had heard stories about Bruce Lee, stories whispered in gyms and back alleys, stories about speed, power, and an almost mythical ability to dominate opponents far larger than himself. But his tone made it clear that he did not believe those stories. To him, words meant nothing without proof. The giant explained that he fought at night for money, in underground places where there were no rules, no referees, and no protection. He made it clear that he was not interested in demonstrations, forms, or philosophy. He was there to test whether Bruce Lee was real or just another name exaggerated by rumor. Every word he spoke carried the unspoken message that he expected this encounter to end the same way his other fights had ended, with someone else humbled and him walking away untouched. Bruce listened quietly, his face calm and unreadable. He did not rise to the challenge verbally, did not defend his reputation, and did not react emotionally. Instead, his attention was focused entirely on the man's posture, the way his weight shifted as he stood, the tension in his shoulders, and the confidence that came from never having been stopped before. In that moment, the gym was no longer a place of training. It had become a test, not just of strength, but of understanding, and the giant had unknowingly walked into a space where size alone would not decide the outcome. The giant stood there with the relaxed arrogance of someone who had never been forced to question his own power. His confidence did not come from discipline or self-control, but from years of intimidation working exactly as he expected it to. He relied on his size, his reach, and the fear he usually saw in other men's eyes. To him, this encounter already felt decided. He expected Bruce Lee to react the way most people did, with nervous movement, defensive excuses, or empty bravado meant to mask uncertainty. That reaction never came. Bruce Lee remained calm, almost unsettlingly so. He did not raise his voice, tense his shoulders, or shift his stance in a way that signaled fear or aggression. Instead, he watched. His eyes traced the giant's movements in quiet detail, noticing the way his weight settled unevenly on his heels, the slight stiffness in his shoulders, and the way his breathing revealed confidence without caution. Bruce was not measuring the man's strength. He was measuring his awareness, and what he saw told him everything he needed to know. When Bruce spoke, his voice was steady and unchallenging. He told the giant that it was late and that he was finished training for the night. There was no insult in his words and no attempt to provoke. This only amused the giant, who laughed and stepped closer, crowding the space and asserting dominance through proximity. In his mind, this was the moment where intimidation should have worked, where Bruce should have backed away or tried to explain himself. Instead, Bruce remained exactly where he was, unmoved by the pressure. Bruce briefly glanced at the clock on the wall, not out of concern, but as if noting a detail that mattered only to him. He then looked back at the giant and calmly said that in 8 seconds, the man would understand everything he needed to know. The words were not spoken as a threat, but as a statement of fact. That calm certainty disrupted the balance of the moment. For the first time since entering the gym, the giant hesitated, not physically, but mentally. His confidence, built on size and reputation, encountered something unfamiliar, a man who did not acknowledge fear or dominance. In that moment, the contrast between the two men became clear. The giant represented confidence without awareness, a belief in power that had never been tested by something truly different. Bruce Lee represented awareness without ego, a quiet readiness built on observation, understanding, and timing. The fight had not yet begun, but the outcome was already taking shape, because in real combat, the man who understands the situation always holds the advantage over the man who assumes control. When the giant finally decided to move, he did so with the confidence of someone who believed the encounter would end in a single, overwhelming moment. He did not test Bruce with light movement or careful probing. Instead, he committed fully, stepping forward with a wide, crushing punch designed to dominate space and end resistance immediately. It was the kind of attack built on raw power rather than precision, the kind that had worked for him countless times against men who froze the moment they felt the weight and intent behind it. The punch was meant to intimidate as much as it was meant to strike, to send a clear message that this fight would follow his rules. Bruce Lee did not react the way the giant expected. He did not retreat, stiffen, or raise his arms in a defensive panic. Instead, he moved forward at the exact moment the punch began to travel, stepping inside the arc of the attack before its full power could develop. His timing was not accidental or instinctive in the way most people understand instinct. It was trained awareness, the result of countless hours studying distance, rhythm, and interception. By closing the gap, Bruce removed the very advantage the giant believed he possessed. As the giant's punch passed behind him, Bruce's lead hand snapped forward in a straight, controlled strike aimed beneath the jawline, disrupting balance and breathing in a single, precise motion. The strike was not thrown with anger or with the intention to impress. It was delivered with purpose, targeting structure rather than ego. Before the giant could register what had happened, Bruce followed with a rapid sequence of short punches, each one economical and direct, landing to the body and head in quick succession. These were not wild blows meant to knock someone unconscious in one moment. They were cumulative, designed to drain strength, overwhelm the nervous system, and deny recovery. The giant tried to respond the only way he knew how, by reaching out to grab and control Bruce, believing that once he could impose his weight, the fight would shift back in his favor. Bruce anticipated this before the attempt fully formed. He angled off smoothly, pivoting just enough to remove himself from the line of force while staying close enough to continue applying pressure. In the same motion, he delivered a low oblique kick to the giant's knee, not with the goal of breaking it, but with the intention of stealing his base and interrupting his ability to move freely. The effect was immediate. The giant's posture collapsed slightly as his leg betrayed him, and his balance, already compromised by the earlier strikes, began to fail. Bruce did not chase wildly or overcommit. He stayed composed, adjusting his position with small, efficient steps that cut off escape routes and denied the giant the space he needed to recover. Every movement Bruce made served a purpose, and every second that passed increased the giant's confusion. Within moments, the man who had entered the gym with complete confidence was no longer in control of his body. His reactions lagged behind his intentions, and his size, once his greatest weapon, had become an obstacle he could not manage quickly enough. He stumbled backward and collapsed onto a stack of training mats, not because he had been knocked out, but because his system could no longer coordinate effectively under the pressure Bruce applied. The fight had barely begun, yet it was already over. What should have been a display of dominance turned into a lesson in timing and efficiency. In those few seconds, Bruce Lee demonstrated something the giant had never encountered before, that power without understanding collapses under precision, and that a fight does not need time to become decisive when it is guided by awareness rather than force. When the giant's body finally hit the training mats, the sound was dull and heavy, not dramatic, but final, in a way that could not be misunderstood. It was not the sound of a man being knocked unconscious, but the sound of control being taken away from someone who had never experienced that loss before. He lay there stunned, his chest rising and falling rapidly as his breathing struggled to return to rhythm. His muscles still tensed as if ready to fight, but his nervous system could not organize itself fast enough to respond. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his life, size and strength were no longer answering his commands. Bruce Lee did not rush forward. He did not stand over the man in triumph or deliver unnecessary strikes to prove a point. Instead, he stepped back calmly, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed, as if the encounter had been nothing more than another training drill. He glanced at the clock on the wall again, not to impress the fallen fighter, but to confirm something for himself. 8 seconds had passed. The time mattered not because it was impressive, but because it revealed a truth. Bruce understood deeply that a real confrontation, when handled correctly, does not need time to become decisive. The giant tried to sit up, only to realize that his balance had not fully returned. His body felt unfamiliar to him, heavy in the wrong places, unresponsive in others. There was no sharp pain that he could point to, no single injury he could blame. What unsettled him was worse than pain. It was confusion. Everything he believed about fighting, intimidation, and dominance had failed him in a matter of seconds. He had entered the gym convinced that fear would win the fight before it even began, and now fear had quietly changed sides. Bruce spoke without raising his voice, telling the man that fighting at night slowed judgment and dulled reaction, and that power without timing only creates false confidence. There was no insult in his words, no attempt to humiliate. The lesson was offered plainly, almost clinically, as if Bruce were explaining a concept rather than addressing an opponent. He turned away without waiting for agreement or apology, signaling that the encounter was already over in his mind. The giant remained on the mats for several long moments after Bruce walked away. His breathing gradually steadied, but his expression remained distant, as though he were replaying the last few seconds again and again, searching for the moment where things had gone wrong. He slowly pushed himself to his feet, his movements careful now, stripped of the careless confidence he had carried into the room. When he finally stood upright, he did not look toward Bruce with anger or resentment. Instead, there was a quiet recognition in his eyes, an understanding that something fundamental had been exposed. He gathered his belongings without speaking, avoiding eye contact, and walked toward the door. When he stepped back into the night, he did so alone, leaving behind not just the gym, but the version of himself that believed size guaranteed victory. Only one man walked away from that encounter, but both men were changed by it in different ways. For Bruce Lee, those 8 seconds were not a moment of celebration, they were a mirror. As effective as the outcome had been, Bruce was already evaluating what could have gone wrong. He knew that if timing had failed by even a fraction, if distance had been misjudged, or if there had been more than one opponent, the situation could have turned dangerous quickly. The encounter reinforced something Bruce never ignored, that efficiency is not about dominance, but about minimizing risk. That brief confrontation confirmed for Bruce that real combat was not a contest of endurance or display, but a matter of interception and resolution. It also reminded him that success does not eliminate vulnerability. Even an 8-second victory carried lessons, and Bruce Lee was never interested in victories that did not teach him something new. In that quiet gym, long after the giant had disappeared into the night, Bruce understood that the true value of those 8 seconds lay not in how quickly the fight ended, but in how clearly it revealed the narrow margin between control and chaos. After the giant finally disappeared into the night, the gym fell quiet again, but it was no longer the same silence that had existed before the fight. The air felt heavier, charged with the aftershock of what had just happened. Bruce Lee remained alone in the room, standing still for a moment as his body cooled and his breathing returned fully to normal. There was no celebration in him, no sense of triumph, and no desire to replay the encounter as proof of superiority. Instead, his mind had already moved past the outcome and into analysis. Bruce slowly sat down on a nearby bench, resting his forearms on his thighs, staring at the floor where the fight had taken place. In his mind, the encounter was already being dissected second by second. He replayed the timing of the interception, the angle of entry, the sequence of strikes, and the moment the giant's balance collapsed. To most fighters, an 8-second victory would have felt perfect. To Bruce, it felt incomplete, not because it failed, but because it revealed how thin the margin truly was. He understood something that most people never confront. A fight that ends quickly does not mean it was safe. Speed hides danger just as easily as it eliminates it. Bruce knew that if his timing had been even slightly off, if the distance had been misjudged by a few inches, the giant's weight could have come crashing down on him. The encounter had succeeded, but success did not erase vulnerability. That realization stayed with him far longer than the fight itself. Bruce flexed his hands slowly, feeling the tension leave his muscles, and noticed the subtle fatigue settling into his body. It bothered him more than he expected. He had ended the confrontation decisively, yet he felt he had used more energy than necessary. He had moved efficiently, but not efficiently enough for his own standards. In his mind, a real fight demanded absolute economy. Every extra step, every unnecessary pursuit, every wasted moment increased risk. What disturbed Bruce most was not the giant's size or aggression, but the fact that the fight had required adaptation under pressure. Bruce believed that true mastery meant reducing uncertainty before conflict even began. The more variables a fight contained, the more dangerous it became. That night confirmed that relying on reactions alone was not enough. Preparation had to evolve beyond techniques into principles that functioned under any condition. Bruce also recognized that victory often feeds ego, and ego dulls growth. He refused to let that happen. Rather than telling himself he had proven something, he reminded himself that he had been tested and exposed. He had seen how quickly chaos could form, how easily momentum could shift, and how unforgiving real confrontation could be. This mindset separated Bruce from most fighters because he did not measure himself by who he defeated, but by how much risk remained in his own method. As the minutes passed, Bruce remained seated, thinking quietly. The gym around him bore small signs of the encounter: slightly displaced mats, scuff marks on the floor, and the faint echo of movement that no longer existed. To anyone else, these would have been reminders of dominance. To Bruce, They were reminders of imperfection. They represented everything he still needed to refine. That night reinforced a core belief that Bruce Lee held throughout his life, that winning is not the same as understanding, and survival is not the same as mastery. The fight had not satisfied him because satisfaction signals an end, and Bruce never allowed himself to feel finished. Every encounter, no matter how brief, was a lesson, and lessons only mattered if they forced change. When Bruce finally stood up and began to put the gym back in order, he was already thinking ahead. He knew that his training would have to change, not in appearance, but in intention. He would need to strip away anything that did not serve efficiency. He would need to question techniques he had once trusted. He would need to train his body and mind to resolve conflict faster, cleaner, and with less exposure to danger. The giant had come looking for proof that Bruce Lee was real. He left without a word, carrying his own lesson into the night. Bruce Lee, however, remained behind, carrying something heavier. He carried the knowledge that even when you win, you are never finished, and that the most dangerous opponent is not the man who challenges you, but the moment you believe you have nothing left to learn. Long after the gym had been cleaned and the night had fully settled into silence, the meaning of that brief encounter continued to unfold in Bruce Lee's mind. What stayed with him was not the speed of the fight or the size of the man who had challenged him, but the realization of how narrow the space was between control and chaos. 8 seconds had been enough to end the confrontation, yet those same 8 seconds revealed how unforgiving real combat could be. Bruce understood that in a true encounter, there is no allowance for beauty, tradition, or pride. There is only what functions under pressure and what fails when reality intrudes. That night reinforced Bruce's growing belief that martial arts had drifted too far from their original purpose. Over time, systems had become rigid, obsessed with preserving form rather than serving function. Techniques were practiced because they were inherited, not because they were effective. Bruce realized that many fighters trained to look skilled rather than to survive uncertainty. The encounter with the giant stripped away those illusions and forced Bruce to confront a difficult truth. Even methods that worked could be refined further, and anything that could not adapt had no place in real fighting. Bruce began to see martial arts not as collections of techniques, but as expressions of understanding. A technique was only useful if it could appear instantly under stress, without thought, hesitation, or preparation. Anything that required setup, formality, or ideal conditions became a liability. That realization drove Bruce to abandon the comfort of systems and labels. He no longer wanted to belong to a style. He wanted freedom. Freedom to respond without restriction, freedom to intercept rather than react, and freedom to end conflict before it fully formed. From that mindset, the philosophy that would later be known as Jeet Kune Do began to take clearer shape. It was not a rejection of all tradition, but a refusal to be imprisoned by it. Bruce believed that truth in combat, like truth in life, must remain alive, flexible, and honest. He believed that clinging to fixed methods was the same as clinging to outdated beliefs, and both could become dangerous when circumstances changed. The fight with the giant was one of many quiet confirmations that reinforced this way of thinking. Bruce also understood something deeper that extended beyond martial arts. He recognized that self-improvement begins the moment comfort ends. The giant had come seeking to dominate, but Bruce left the encounter questioning himself. That difference in perspective defined who Bruce Lee was. He never measured success by how easily he defeated others. He measured it by how much more clearly he could see his own limitations afterward. Every challenge was an opportunity to expose weakness, and weakness, once exposed, became a guide rather than a failure. In the days that followed, Bruce adjusted his training, not by adding more techniques, but by removing what was unnecessary. He focused on speed, timing, and economy of motion. He studied biomechanics, boxing, fencing, and anything that could sharpen interception and efficiency. The goal was no longer to accumulate knowledge, but to refine understanding. The fight had reminded him that real mastery was not about knowing many things, but about needing fewer things to succeed. The giant who had entered the gym that night disappeared back into anonymity, carrying his own unspoken lesson. Bruce never spoke publicly about the encounter, not because it embarrassed him, but because it was never meant to be a story of dominance. It was a private moment of clarity, a reminder that evolution happens quietly and that true growth rarely announces itself. What made Bruce Lee legendary was not the fights he won, but the way he refused to let victory blind him. He treated every encounter as a mirror, reflecting not his power, but his responsibility to improve. That mindset extended beyond combat and into life itself. Bruce believed that stagnation was the real enemy, and that continuous adaptation was the highest form of discipline. The fight lasted only seconds, but its lesson lasted a lifetime. It pushed Bruce further down a path that rejected complacency and embraced constant refinement. In that sense, the giant was never the true opponent. The true opponent was limitation, tradition without purpose, and the comfort of believing one had already arrived. That night did not make Bruce Lee famous. It made him sharper. It reminded him that the journey of mastery has no final destination, only deeper understanding. And that understanding, more than any victory, is what ultimately made Bruce Lee into a legend. When people speak about Bruce Lee, they often focus on speed, power, and dominance, but those who truly understand his legacy know that his greatest strength was not physical at all. It was his refusal to become satisfied with who he already was. That night, in the quiet gym, when a towering fighter entered with confidence and left with silence, was never meant to be remembered as a moment of humiliation or victory. It was a moment of truth, a moment where reality stripped away illusion and left only what genuinely worked. Bruce Lee did not walk away from that encounter feeling superior. He walked away feeling responsible to evolve, to question himself, and to remove anything in his training that created unnecessary risk. While others might have told the story as proof of invincibility, Bruce understood something deeper, that invincibility is a myth, and growth only happens when you acknowledge vulnerability. The fight ended quickly, but the questions it raised stayed with him for the rest of his life. What separated Bruce Lee from most fighters was not how quickly he could end a confrontation, but how honestly he evaluated himself afterward. He never allowed victory to become comfort, and he never allowed comfort to become stagnation. Every challenge, no matter how brief, was treated as feedback. Every encounter revealed something that could be refined, simplified, or improved. This mindset shaped not only the way he fought, but the way he lived. The lesson of that night extends far beyond martial arts. It speaks to anyone who believes they have already arrived, anyone who clings to old methods simply because they are familiar, and anyone who mistakes confidence for awareness. Bruce Lee showed that true strength comes from adaptability, and that the willingness to change is more powerful than any technique. He taught that effectiveness is not about having more tools, but about needing fewer tools under pressure. The giant who challenged Bruce Lee came seeking proof and left with silence. Bruce Lee remained, carrying a lesson that would influence generations. That lesson was simple, yet difficult to accept. Mastery is never finished. Growth never ends. The moment you believe you have nothing left to learn is the moment you begin to fall behind. In the end, the fight was never about size, strength, or even combat. It was about evolution. It was about the courage to let go of what no longer serves you and the discipline to pursue what truly works. Bruce Lee did not become a legend because he defeated others. He became a legend because he refused to stop refining himself. And that is why, long after the echoes of that 8-second fight faded into the night, its lesson continues to live on, not in stories of dominance, but in the quiet truth that the greatest battle is not against the person who challenges you, but against the limits you accept for yourself.